Okay, this is lesson number 5 on gender in the church and gender, and we're going to be looking again at the complementarian and egalitarian perspectives. Just one more reminder, complementarians are going to say men and women are equal, but function differently and have different roles. Egalitarians are going to say if there's a difference in status or role, then we don't actually have equality, and we need to have equality. That's basic ideas. I'm sure someone would say I'm not defining those exactly right, but that's going to get you in the ballpark of it. Today we're going to look at the fall, coming from Genesis chapter 3 and following. This is 1 through 7. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God actually say, 'You shall not eat of any tree in the garden?' And the woman said to the serpent, 'We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You shall not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.' So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. When the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths." Okay, the big question that comes out of this text is, who is responsible for this evil that comes into the world? A mistake has been made, and all humanity is going to deal with the consequences for the rest of ever. Okay, that's the whole Bible and all of human history, is figuring out what's next. Okay, who's responsible? Well, there's kind of 3 answers to that question, depending on what you're looking at. You could say, well, there's 2 people in the story, Adam and Eve. Let's blame them. You could say, well, but Paul seems to think it's Adam. In Romans 5, 12 and 14, he says, sin entered the world by Adam. 1 Corinthians 15, 21, 22 says the same thing, which makes it sound like Eve kind of gets off, but it's actually Adam that's on the hook for the sin of the universe. On the other hand, in 1 Timothy 2:14, same writer, Paul, emphasizes Eve. Eve was deceived and Adam was not, he says, as if she was the one that got tricked, and then Adam, poor Adam. Okay, so she's to blame. I suppose we could add a fourth and say it was the devil that did it, but in this discussion, we're just interested in Adam and Eve. Historically, there have been some less than desirable interpretations of this story. I'll give you a little quick tour down memory lane of church history. Tertullian, who wrote, he died in 220 AD. He actually, if I'm remembering right, Tertullian is the one who coined the term Trinity. He's an important Christian thinker. Here's his explanation of what happened. "Do you not know that you," speaking to women, by the way, "are each an Eve? The sentence of God on this sex of yours lives in this age. The guilt must necessity live too. You are the devil's gateway. You are the unsealer of that forbidden tree. You are the first deserter of the divine law. You are she who persuaded him whom the devil was not valiant enough to attack. You destroyed so easily God's image, man. On account of your desert, that is death, even the Son of God had to die." Whew. That one gives me the heebie-jeebies. I like Tertullian, not there, right? He seems to think that it really is all women. We would have been fine without you guys. The devil didn't even bother to tempt us because he knew he couldn't tempt a man. Well, I think human history has probably shown us that's just not the case. Men are very temptable. But he says, you're the devil's gateway. He's really emphatic about that. I don't like that. Not at all. John Chrysostom, one of the great preachers of church history, 347 to 407 AD, wrote, "The woman taught once and ruined all. On this account, therefore, he saith, let her not teach, for the sex is weak and fickle, and he is collectively," or speaking of the sex collectively, right? So one time we listened to a woman and the whole world literally went to hell, right? We destroyed the world by listening to a woman. And so that's the problem. Again, Chrysostom, putting a bit more stock on one reading of the passage than, the other passages I mentioned a moment ago where Paul blames Adam instead of Eve. And then Thomas Aquinas, the greatest thinker of the medieval era, bar none, wrote, "The human group would have lacked the benefit of order had some of its members not been governed by others who were wiser. Such is the subjection in which woman is by nature subordinate to man, because the power of rational discernment is by nature stronger in man." So Aquinas goes a step further than maybe your typical complementarian. Complementarian says there's a hierarchy built into the creation. Aquinas says it's because men are smarter. Again, cringeworthy comments from the great Aquinas, and we look back and say, nope, missed it, pal. I've met too many women smarter than me to think that's true. John Wesley of Methodist fame, 1703, 1791, said this verse, referring to 1 Timothy 2 and also this text in Genesis, shows why she ought not to teach. She is more easily deceived and more easily deceives. So she's not only deceived herself, she's deceptive. Okay, so I say all that to say, I want to openly admit, in the great history of Christian thought, there have been some really dumb things said about men and women, in particular about women, and this question of the fall. There's been a lot of lousy sermons preached on this story. These interpretations seem to claim that women are inherently less intelligent than men, or at least more gullible. These interpretations seem to ignore other statements by Paul, which candidly blame Adam. In fact, if I were going to say, Paul more often blames Adam than the one time he blames Eve. So to take away from that therefore women must be dumb, and that's the problem, well, then what does that say about Adam? If you're the one that got fooled by the woman and she's dumb, what does that say about you? Again, the whole thing just doesn't add up to me. And I think that's just a brutally bad interpretation of any of these passages. I'm sorry to all women and all men who have ever heard these interpretations from a pulpit. That's not legitimate. So what could we say? A complementarian is going to read Genesis chapter 3 and say, the serpent subverted male headship by tempting Eve rather than Adam. And Eve sinned not only in eating, but by eating first. She is a negative model because she acts autonomously rather than submissively. So a complementarian is going to emphasize that there is an order. It's not an order of intelligence, but there's an issue of pride at stake when a person doesn't acknowledge and live according to the function and the hierarchy that they have. And so because she acted out of order, she's responsible in that sense. Man is responsible because he wasn't the leader of his home, would be the complementarian point of view. Egalitarian point of view would say Paul's statements assumes, later on Paul's statements, not Genesis obviously, Paul's statements assumes a cultural context where women were more susceptible to deceit because they lacked education. Married early, husbands were generally much older, and were socially constrained, limited exposure to culture in the culture. In Paul's cultural setting, women were more easily deceived than men, and Paul uses Eve as an analogy. So they might say, yeah, Paul does say women were easily deceived when he interprets the fall passage in Genesis 3, because in his world, because no one was educating women, they were more easily deceived. Yeah, I think it goes without saying, if you don't ever educate women, they won't be as educated as men. That goes without saying. But that doesn't answer the question, what if we educate men and women alike? Oh, well, then maybe it's not the same. So the egalitarian perspective is, you need to understand Paul's point of view about woman is deceived by saying, well, there's some context to that, where Paul would say that. That wouldn't make the same sense today because we don't have the same educational setting. That would be one perspective. There's several egalitarian perspectives on both the Pauline passage, where he references this, and in the Genesis passage in chapter 3. Going back to Genesis 3, a passage we talked about it's been a couple lessons now. The first lesson, we talked about this one. Genesis 3, 16 through 19 is the consequence passage. To the woman, he said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be contrary to your husband, or for or towards your husband, depending on your translation. But he shall rule over you. And to Adam, he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you, in pain. You shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. But the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So, a couple of things that, again, kind of agreed on, I think, or should be agreed on, between complementarians and egalitarians. Genesis 3:16 is not the basis of headship. So let me just get this right out there. If you're preaching a sermon or teaching a class and you want to make the case that the man is the head of woman, don't quote Genesis 3:16. Whichever point of view you take, that's not the right verse. Okay? There are passages that talk about headship. This passage is talking about the fallen consequence of sin. Because of sin, this relationship is damaged. Sin has invaded the gender relationship. And so there's something wrong in this passage. And God is pointing it out. He's saying, this is what happens when you don't do what I say. It's not a punishment. I think we misunderstand that too. Some will say this is a punishment. God's telling woman she's going to be subservient because she sinned first. No, it's a consequence. Both man and woman get pain because of sin. It's different pain, it's different suffering, but they both get it. But it's a consequence. Imagine a small child reaches up and touches a hot stove. They get burned. That's not a penalty. That's not a punishment, right? You didn't say, oh, you touched the stove, so arbitrarily I'm going to burn your hand so you stop doing that. Rather, it's a consequence. I warned you, if you touch that, it's going to hurt. And I feel terrible for you, but I can't change the fact that touching hot things burns your hand, okay? And that's what this verse is about. God is saying after the fact, I told you not to do that, you did it anyway, and now here's what the rest of human history looks like. Men and women are not going to get along. It's going to be a problem. It's going to be bad. It's going to be, in places, abusive. And he's not bragging on that. He's not even penalizing them with that. He's saying that is a consequence of evil, and we should oppose it. Genesis 3:16 is the beginning, then, of the battle of the sexes. It is not prescriptive. It's descriptive. It's not saying, well, now you've sinned. Here's what I want you to do. It's saying, oh, you sinned. Here's how that's going to go down. If there is prescriptive information in Genesis, it's in the previous chapters. This is definitely descriptive. Both points of view agree on that. There is a little translation grief here to go through that I mentioned, I think, a couple of times now. The NRSV says, your desire shall be for your husband, he shall rule over you. I think that's the correct way to render that personally. The ESV has changed it to say, your desire will be contrary to the husband. This is the same terminology used later in Genesis chapter 4:7, when God is talking about sin, and he says, sin, its desire is for you, but you must master it. Very similar statement. And so I think what it's saying is something's wrong here, something's out of whack here, something isn't right. God doesn't want sin to rule your life. He's not saying, yay, sin's in charge now, but that something has gone wrong, and we're going to have to reckon with it. What's the egalitarian perspective on this? This story, for the egalitarian, reveals that patriarchy, misogyny, and all gender equality originate in sin. At the very least, I think you have to agree that some originates in sin. Like, there's no debating that. In my reading of the text, which I'm giving you here from 2 points of view, as if there's 2 people in my head, both of them agree that definitely some of the problems between gender come from sin. That should go without saying. It's absolutely true. But the egalitarian perspective is going to say all of it does. The complementarian position says some of it does. Okay. So the egalitarian perspective says this story reveals that patriarchy, misogyny, and all gender inequality originate from the problem of sin and ought to be reversed. That's our goal as Christians, to reverse the consequence of sin through Christ Jesus. Complementarians would say, well, the story reveals that God's original arrangement for gender has been corrupted by sin, but the original created headship of man should in fact be restored. They would point out, yes, something is very wrong here in this verse, but there's nothing wrong in Genesis 2 when the headship principle is brought on the table. So they would emphasize, yes, absolutely something is wrong with the current relationship between men and women. But headship is not part of the problem. Hierarchy isn't part of the problem. They would say that's part of God's created order, and our goal is to get back to that. So, again, another short video today because I just wanted to give you time to work through the Genesis text on your own, study it, discuss it, and think about it. talk about these perspectives, and then next week we'll move on to the rest of the Old Testament, kind of in a big rush.